Hello. Should be up and running. Everyone, give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. Cool. All right, we're going to start in just a minute. I know a few people have been contacting me. We're trying to kind of sort out the link era, so we will get started in just a second. I want to give people a chance to get on here. Cool. Okay, so we'll get rocking and rolling, and hopefully some more people join us as we get going. So we'll get rocking, and then people can join in. If you have questions, feel free to write them in the attendee chat. I'll answer them all at the end, just so we can get through all the information. Then we can do a Q&A at the end. So today's topic: 5 best ways to support your immune system. Kind of a fitting topic for the current situation that we're going through today. But my big goal with the talk tonight is not just tell you a bunch of supplements to take without you really understanding why and things like that. My goal tonight is actually to kind of go over some basic immunology principles so you can start getting a picture of really how complex it all is, and that, when some individuals say, everyone take this, or everyone take, turmeric or curcumin or resveratrol, or vitamin D, vitamin A, sometimes that's appropriate for people. Other times it's not, right? And so as we go through tonight, you're going to start to get a better picture of, depending on whether you want to calm down inflammation in the immune system, whether you want to activate the immune system, whether you want it to just work kind of better in general, you'll kind of get an idea of how certain supplements fit in. Like I said, we're going to talk about more than kind of 5 things, but you'll have a good idea of how things like vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin C, things like glutathione, certain Chinese herbs, how they kind of work at different aspects of the immune system, so you'll know when to kind of use them, right? So my goal is to have you leave this not only having some tactics and some ideas to support yourself, but also a little bit better understanding of how to support your immune system, whether you have an autoimmune disorder or whether you catch the cold or have an infection, right? And so we're going to go through some stuff. This is not a lecture on, COVID or coronavirus. Granted, I think some of this can fit in there, and like I said, I'll kind of talk about some things as they relate to coronavirus. Once again, we're learning things every day, and there's still a lot of studying to be done about what things are going to be effective. But in here, I'm going to give you just general antiviral kind of things that work. Are those going to work totally for coronavirus or COVID? We don't fully know. Some of these things are being researched and studied now. So, like I said, it's not a complete lecture on coronavirus, but you can take some of these thoughts and ideas and kind of put them into action. And I'll talk about the things that I'm doing, right, to support myself, to try to give me the best probability that either not getting sick, or if I do get sick, that I do well with getting sick. Okay, so let's get rocking and rolling. So, the immune system. What is our immune system really? In simple, your immune system is your body's natural defense against pathogens and foreign invaders, also cancer cells and things like that. So, not only foreign invaders, but mutated cells in your body. Your immune system does a huge job in modulating cancer and cancer cells and things like that, right? The immune system is largely going to be made up of 2 different arms, right? Your innate immune system and your adaptive or acquired immune system. For some of you, this may be review. For some of you, this may be completely foreign language. So I'm going to try to kind of meet in the middle ground, and take a really complex topic and make sure everyone kind of leaves with a better understanding of it. Okay. So we're going to go into a few pictures that lay this out a little bit better. So going back to it, two big arms I want you to think about with the immune system. We're going to keep it simple. The innate and the adaptive immune system, okay? Your innate immune system, think about it, it is in all of your barrier systems. What do I mean by barrier systems? Your mouth, your nose, your throat, your stomach, your lungs, kind of pretty much any surface that protects you from the outside world is going to have a strong connection with the innate immune system, okay? Your innate immune system is pretty much gives you the same stereotypical response every time, right? It's what gives you a fever. It's what gives you the chills, the body aches, right? It gets the inflammation going, right? So when you get sick, right, that sick a lot of times is the symptoms of your immune system working. So a lot of individuals think that that's necessarily the pathogen. You getting sick and all the symptoms that come with it is you trying to fight that off. That is your innate immune system, right? And your innate immune system kicks up first, right? Usually within the first 12 hours, it is your innate immune system. And within a few days, you start to create a pretty robust adaptive immune response, okay? So your innate immune system sounds the alarm, gets things going. Your adaptive immune system comes in a little bit later and starts producing a ton of other immune cells that we're going to go over that help you to start killing pathogens or invaders or cancer cells, whatever it may be, and start to produce what are called antibodies and memory cells, which are pretty much going to be cells that are going to remember that pathogen, that virus or bacteria, so that if you get exposed to it in a month next year, you're going to have a more robust immune response and you're going to get over that infection even quicker, right? This is kind of the idea behind vaccinations, is to create an immune response so that in hopes that if you do get exposed, your immune response will be more robust. Okay. So if we look at this picture, so kind of a complicated picture, but a cool picture, and some of you may recognize these, right? So we have the innate immune system on the left. Okay. So we have what are called dendritic cells, which we'll talk about a little bit more in depth. You have eosinophils, which for those of you who have had blood work or had a CBC done, you would have seen eosinophils on there, basophils, monocytes, neutrophils, and things like that on your blood work, right? So when you're getting your blood work, that's giving you a snapshot somewhat into your innate immune system, but also your adaptive immune system. Then we have things like natural killer cells, mast cells, all those things we'll get into a little bit more in depth. And then on the adaptive immune side, we have T cells and we have B cells. And we're going to break those down a little bit more in depth, especially T cells, right? That's going to give us a foundation of how we're going to kind of think of the immune system and how it responds. Okay. So to start, I think the big key that a lot of people don't talk about when they talk about immune function and building immune strength is barrier systems. Like I said, your barrier systems are your first line of defense in keeping you from getting even exposed to pathogens, right? Let's take your sinuses. And honestly, the current infection we have, right? Different respiratory infections, right? They're either droplet, right? Or you touch something and then you touch your face, right? Or you inhale particles or things like that that have been aspirated or have come from one's mouth or sinuses, right? So when things enter your sinuses, right, you produce mucus, you have cilia, you have all these things, right, to try to move those pathogens out, right? So when someone has a robust, say, sinus barrier system, sometimes they're able to expel pathogens and not even give them a chance to get into circulation, right? Because things have to move from your sinuses to your throat to your lungs. And think about the progression of like a cold or an upper respiratory illness, right? Starts usually with a sinus issue, moves to the throat, you get a sore throat, and then eventually it moves to your chest, right? So the better your barrier systems are and your innate immune response in those barrier systems, the more likely you're going to be able to fight that infection off better than if you didn't, right? Other barrier systems are your lungs, right, which produce what are called surfactants and mucus. So surfactants, once again, help to get rid of mucus and move them out of the lungs, right? So when one produces pneumonia or things where mucus just sits in the lung, you want surfactants because it helps you to get rid of mucus, right? It plays a role in regulating mucus density, liquid density, and things like that. And then your GI system, right? So your intestines, your small intestine, and your large intestine, those are barrier systems. In your skin, right? And your skin uses sweating and flushing, right, to try to clear things off your skin, right? So your barrier systems are really, really important. We're going to go briefly into your GI, your gut barrier system a little bit and some things you can do. But what we're going to do in future lectures is we're going to build on all of these, and we're going to do one on kind of your sinuses and how do you bulletproof your sinus barrier system, your lung, your GI, and all those different things, right? So important thing is to think about barrier systems first of all, okay? So let's move a little bit more in depth to different types of immune cells. Now, once again, we're going to breeze through these because my goal is to not make everyone immunologists, but I think it's good to have an understanding of what these cells mean so that you know when you're taking certain supplements, why you're taking them, okay? So natural killer cells. Think of natural killer cells just like they sound, right? Natural killer cells go around and they scan the environment, and what they'll do is certain infections will get tagged with certain markers, right? And natural killer cells, their job are to identify certain markers on cells and know whether to attack and kill that cell or whether to leave it alone. The problem is some viruses are able to hijack that mechanism in cells so that it's difficult for the cells to say, hey, come kill me, right? And that's why natural killer cells have kind of evolved as viruses and bacteria have evolved to try to, once again, compete with each other, right? Because as viruses evolve, natural killer cells have to evolve to be able to recognize those things, right? Natural killer cells also play a huge role in cancer, right? In recognizing cancer cells, or cells that aren't necessarily healthy. And we'll get into that a little bit more in detail later about how the immune system recognizes these things so that natural killer cells can produce chemicals to ultimately kill pathogens, right? So sometimes an individual might want to boost their natural killer cell function in order to fight an infection or honestly even to help an autoimmune disease, right? And you can test natural killer cells. We can look at ratios. So some people need natural killer cell support, others don't. Individuals who tend to have lower natural killer cell function tend to have more chronic infections, more kind of pathogen burden, right? So maybe Epstein-Barr virus, herpes virus, right? Those are the patients that have all these different infections, Lyme disease, and they just can't seem to fight them. Sometimes they need a boost in their natural killer cell function to help them fight that pathogen burden, okay? Next, we have what are called phagocytes, okay? And these guys also are called macrophages, okay? Some of you might have heard of different types of ones in the body. So like in the brain, you have what are called microglial cells. And for those of you who are patients of mine, I'm sure you've heard me talk about microglial cells, right? They're the janitor or the macrophage of the brain. In the liver, you have what are called Kupffer cells, right? Those are the macrophages or the janitor. And in the lungs, you have alveolar macrophages, okay? If you were to be looking at blood work, these could also be neutrophils and monocytes, right? So the whole idea between phagocytes or macrophages, like you can see in the picture, is to find a bacteria or a virus, engulf it, right? Eat it, and then process it, right? As it goes into the cell, that macrophage now processes it, takes a little piece of it, and then presents it on the outside of its cell to say, hey, immune system, this is what the bad guy looks like. Come and get him, right? The problem can be is sometimes viruses can hijack that system, right? So it's finding that balance, and you want macrophages and phagocytes that work really, really well, right? You want them to be able to engulf a pathogen and then present it to your immune system while not creating too much inflammation or while not getting hijacked by a virus, right? And we're going to talk about different nutrients that help that process to work a little bit smoother. Okay. So we talked about a few different things in the innate immune response. So barrier systems, natural killer cells, and then macrophages or phagocytes. Okay. The next thing we're going to talk about is what are called T cells. Some of you may be familiar with these. Some of these, this may be a complete foreign language to you, right? And there's going to be some busy pictures, but I'm going to walk you through, right? And this is going to be a simplistic way to think about how to support your immune system. Now, once again, immunology is a very complex topic. So, it's evolving every day and we're learning new things. So once again, this is a simplistic view on a complex topic, okay? So when we look at T cells, we have what are called naive T cells, or at the top of this picture, the THO or zero cell. So it's a T cell, kind of like a stem cell. It doesn't really have an identity yet. It doesn't know what it wants to do quite yet. And depending on what's happening in the body's chemistry, whether there's an infection, whether there's inflammation, whether there's cancer, whatever there may be, this will send off certain signaling molecules. And these signaling molecules will help to form that T cell into either a Th1 cell, a Th2, a Th17, or a Treg cell. Technically, there's 7 to 8 different types of T cells. We're going to talk about 4, right? Kind of the 4 main ones that are really well researched. There's probably more. We may learn next year that there's 20, it's kind of a growing field, but these are the 4 big ones that are really researched, okay? So let's dive into them. Okay. So once again, some of you that have been in our clinic are going to be familiar with these topics, but I'm going to go a little bit more in depth in them. And some of you who aren't patients might never have heard of these, right? So these are T helper cells. Okay. So Th1. So T helper cell type 1. Okay. This type of T cell is really important in assisting you in killing bacteria and viruses. Okay. Think of your Th1 system as being more tied in with your innate immune system. Your innate immune system in your Th1 system is all about killing pathogens, killing bacteria, killing viruses, because as we're going to see, your Th1 system drives the production of more macrophages, but also more natural killer cells. Okay. Remember, macrophages and natural killer cells are part of your innate immune system largely, right? And T cells are going to help to drive that. Okay. They're going to use certain chemicals. Now, once again, I'm not asking anyone to remember these chemicals, but the reason I put them in there is that we'll talk about how certain nutrients affect these chemicals, right? So that's why we can talk about how curcumin or resveratrol or quercetin or vitamin D will affect these signaling molecules so that we can shift the immune balance into a certain direction. Okay, so your Th1 system is going to respond to what's called interferon gamma, interleukin 12 and interleukin 2, and what's called STAT4. So STAT is pretty much just a transcribing system, right? Think of STAT. We're going to talk about different types of STAT. Think of STAT as the book with the blueprints. And depending whether it's STAT4, STAT5, STAT3, it's going to tell you the instructions to make a certain cell. Okay. And the interleukins are going to be what are called cytokines, which are chemicals that signal to do different things. Okay. And interferon gamma is what's largely going to be used by natural killer cells to help kill infections, but also to further drive that Th1 response, right? So if you are getting an acute infection, right, whether it's the cold, whether it's honestly even coronavirus, you want a robust Th1 response initially to fight that infection, okay? Your Th1 system diminishes with age, chronic stress, sleep issues, and chronic inflammation. So we're going to talk about how to address those things briefly and why they're so important. And once again, why we notice that when we're chronically stressed, we get sick easier, and why when we don't sleep well, we tend to get sick easier, okay? This is very important in understanding how to lower pathogen burden, right? All of us live in a world where we're constantly going to be exposed to infections, whether we're bit by, ticks, spiders, whatever it may be, or viruses, bacteria, right? All of us are going to be kind of giant buckets full of kind of holding pathogens. So our goal is how can we lower that burden? Because the lower we can bring that pathogen burden, the less inflammation and the more robust of an immune response you can have. When you have a high amount of pathogen burden, so a lot of infections, that's going to drive your Th1 system down, and you're going to have a really hard time when you get infected with something else, right? These are the patients that just can't bounce back from getting sick, okay? Now we're going to talk about T helper cell type 2 or Th2 cells, okay? I want you to think of these in regards to more so hollow organs. So when we think of sinuses, nose, mouth, throat, lungs, GI system, those are all hollow spaces, right? And whenever we have dysfunction in hollow spaces, so chronic sinus issues or sinusitis, GI issues, whether it's, you know, irritable bowel syndrome, inflammatory bowel disease, whatever it may be, or an inflammatory lung condition, that is largely an issue or an imbalance in the Th2 system, right? So there's tends to be more of a polarization or a stronger Th2 system in those responses, right? Because whenever there's inflammation or infections in those areas, it drives that Th2 system. So an idea of if someone might have more of a polarized Th2 immune system, they may have allergies. They may have really bad asthma, chronic sinus issues, maybe postnasal drip, right? You're seeing this imbalance between your Th2 and your Th1 system to where you're trying to produce all this mucus to get rid of things, but you don't have enough of a robust Th1 response to actually get rid of them, right? So the Th2 system has to do with killing parasites and dealing with environmental toxins. So you're going to start to see how the world we live in can drive a dominance, right? If I live in a world where I'm exposed to mold, a lot of toxins, I have chronic sinus issues, allergies, asthma, you're going to start to see that I'm going to be pushed into that Th2 dominance, right? And I may have a less than adequate and an innate immune response so that when I get sick, I might not be able to fight it, right? Or vice versa. People who tend to have more of a robust Th1 system tend to have arthropathies, right? Arthritis of different types. They tend to be more inflamed, right? They're creating too much of an inflammatory response. So we're going to talk about how do we balance these because both of them are very, very important aspects of the immune system. We just need to make sure that they work together and they turn on and then they turn off when they should. Okay. So like I said, when you think of Th2 response, I want you to think of asthma, allergies, excessive mucus, lung issues, sinus issues, GI issues, okay? And then we're going to have what are called Treg cells. Some call them Th3 cells, but the more appropriate name for them is called Treg cells or T regulatory cells. These are T helper cells that help to balance that immune response. They help to balance that Th1 and that Th2 response, right? So they modulate the immune system, right? And once again, we talk about this a lot with our patients. We want a Th1 and a Th2 response, but we want them to be balanced. We want them to be modulated. So this is the importance of your Treg system, right? So this improves immune tolerance and pushes you away from autoimmunity. Now, once again, you don't want to push necessarily Treg cells all the time because that can dampen, once again, your innate immune response. So once again, it's all about finding the balance and more specifically, finding what's specific for you as an individual, right? And this is where you can look at certain lab work to find, do you have a dominance? Do you need more support in one arena versus the other, right? Because one thing isn't good necessarily for everyone else. So those are Treg cells. Okay. And then we have what are called Th17 cells. Some of you may be familiar with these, some of you may not. So for a while in the autoimmunity research, there was a lot of discussion that Th1 or the innate immune system was the culprit behind autoimmunity. After about 2008, 2009, in the immunology kind of research world, that started to shift, right? And they started to look a little bit more at the Th17 system as more of the culprit in autoimmunity or tissue destruction, right? So we'll talk about this a little bit more as we go through some other things. But when you hear Th17, I want you to think of inflammation and tissue destruction largely, okay? And the signaling molecules are what are called STAT3, interleukin 6, and TGF beta. Now, this is interesting. If you've been following a lot of the coronavirus stuff or the COVID-19, there's a lot of discussion that one of the big problems is that it is creating what's called a cytokine storm or excessive inflammation. So once again, it's creating this excessive innate immune response, and there's becoming this huge imbalance in being able to calm down the inflammation. And they're looking at what's called interleukin 6 as one of the culprits. So some of the drugs on the market that they're looking at are interleukin 6 inhibitors to try to drive down the inflammation. And then when you look at TGF beta is a growth factor that has to do with increasing fibrosis, especially in the lungs. So this is another marker that they're tending to see be higher in lung conditions, but especially COVID patients, is they're getting this response of excessive inflammation, which drives the TGF beta, which leads to fibrosis and even more damage of the lungs, right? So it's important to look at those things because we're going to talk about some certain herbs and some certain molecules in the research that have been shown to modulate interleukin 6 and STAT3, not necessarily in coronavirus specifically, but in other viral infections and things like that. So once again, we don't know if they'll work. I have a suspicion that, they most likely probably will to a certain extent. So I'm kind of in the process of, we have to take the research we have and apply it, because a lot of these things are relatively safe, right? And there's little side effects. So, like I said, we're going to talk about things that inhibit STAT3 and interleukin 6 to decrease damage that's done from an infection, right? We don't want too much damage done to our lung tissue if we have an infection. We want to start inflammation, kill the infection, and then stop inflammation before we create too much damage. Because when we create damage, this is where individuals start to have to be hospitalized, intubated, or come out with serious side effects, right? So that's our goal, is to modulate inflammation with an immune response. Okay. So this is kind of a cool picture that I like. It's kind of a busy picture. Like I said, don't worry about memorizing this. There's a lot of stuff that probably looks like a foreign language to a lot of you, but I like this picture because it maps out what we've been talking about. In the center, you have a naive T cell, and we look at all the different paths it can go into a Th1 cell to create more of a robust innate immune response and fight an infection, or into a Th2 system to maybe create more mucus or more inflammation in a hollow body, or to fight a parasite. It could go into Treg cells to try to regulate and create immune tolerance or homeostasis. Or is it going to drive into more of a Th17 response, which is more inflammatory and driving of autoimmune functions, right? So we're going to look at all these chemicals and all the things that can drive you into some of these different systems. And we're going to finish up with one more cell, and then we're going to review, is dendritic cells. And I would argue that dendritic cells are pretty interesting and really, really important in the immune system, because what they really do is they link the innate and the adaptive immune system together. So the problem in a lot of autoimmune disorders, infections, things like that, is that there's not good communication between the innate and the adaptive immune system. Okay, this is what dendritic cells do. Okay, they act as what's called antigen presenting cells. Okay, just like it sounds, it's a cell that presents an antigen, an infection, a virus, a bacteria, a piece of a tumor cell, whatever it may be, to your immune system, to your adaptive immune system. So your antigen presenting cell, your dendritic cell, takes a chunk off of from the macrophage. Okay, say it's in your lungs, right? And that antigen presenting cell takes a chunk of what that pathogen looks like, and then it moves into your bloodstream, into your lymph nodes. And in your lymph nodes, it presents what that cell looks like to your T cells, to your T cell and your B cell. Okay, so this is a point where it hands off the fragment, and your immune system has to decide, well, what do I do? Well, let's say you have a really intense exercise session, right? And so you have a lot of breakdown and inflammation of muscle tissue, okay? You're going to have dendritic cells that are going to take that self tissue to your lymph node and present it to your immune system. It is now the goal of your immune system to recognize that that's self tissue. And when it does that appropriately, your T cell says, oh, cool, I don't need to worry about that. That's just my own self tissue. And then that T cell dies or kills itself, right? Which is what we want it to do. It goes through what's called apoptosis, right? Versus if we have an infection, say in our lungs, our immune system takes that pathogen via the dendritic cell to our lymph nodes, and it says, hey, T cell, here is an infection, I think. What do you think this is? And then your T cell kind of looks at it and says, yep, I think that's a viral infection of this type. Okay, we need to start creating more Th1 cells or more Th17 cells or whatever it may be, right? And then you create an immune response, okay, which is what we want. Now, the problem is, say you have an infection, something like COVID, coronavirus, whatever it may be, and you start to damage your lungs, right? And you're taking bits of that coronavirus and you're taking it to your lymph nodes. But the problem is the damage could be so severe that all of a sudden you're also bringing chunks of your lung to your lymph node. And then the problem is now when you're handing off self tissue with an infection, that now you run the risk of starting an autoimmune disorder, right? It just increases the risk because now you have self tissue with a pathogen, and now your immune system might identify them as the same thing, right? So this is where it can be dangerous, is when you have self tissue with a pathogen. That's what can lead to autoimmunity. What's really cool, and we'll talk about a little bit later, is this is a big area where vitamin D plays a huge role. Vitamin D plays a very large role in making sure that handoff between the dendritic cell or the antigen presenting cell to a T cell goes off smoothly. This is why low vitamin D is associated with almost every autoimmune disease and a lot of different cancers. Now, once again, it's not the only thing, but you see it associated because it helps in that handoff process, right? This is why vitamin D is so important, is it helps link the innate and the adaptive immune system together, okay? So here's kind of a quick summary before we go into some more things in regards to inflammation, right? Remember, we have our anatomical or physiological barriers. So our skin, our lungs, our stomach, our tears, saliva, right? We have our barrier systems. And then we have our innate immune system, which has the natural killer cells, the macrophages, the neutrophils. And then we have our adaptive immune system, which largely consists of T cells and B cells, right? In the T cell arena, right? Remember, we have naive T cells that can turn into Th1 cells, Th2 cells, Th17, or Treg cells largely. And then your B cells make antibodies or memory cells so that you're more efficient next time you see something, right? So that's a quick 30-minute synopsis of the immune system. And once again, I know that that was probably a lot for some of you. For others, that might have been, a review. But I think it's really important to understand those aspects, okay? And I can answer any questions at the end if people have those, okay? So let's talk about inflammation, because once again, a large part of having an efficient immune response that doesn't drive you into autoimmunity or serious issues is keeping inflammation at bay, right? Especially during this time, right, with the current situation in the virus, I would urge everyone that one of the simplest things you can start doing is do things that lower your overall inflammation. And we'll talk about why that's important. What are some things that can increase inflammation that all of us are exposed to on a daily basis? Certain foods, food allergies, whether someone may have a gluten intolerance, an issue with dairy, an issue with nightshades, whatever it may be, food is one of the easiest things we can control. And I say easy because I know it can be very difficult to make those changes, but it's something that we have complete control over, of the foods we put in our body, and make sure that the foods we're putting into our body are anti-inflammatory, right? Or that they're not exacerbating the process. Because once again, if you're getting an infection, you're getting inflammation, the last thing you need to do is increase that inflammatory burden with foods that aren't good for you, right? And some of you may know foods that may not work for you. Others may not, right? The other big thing is blood sugar roller coasters or elevated blood sugar. So diabetics. We know that diabetics seem to be having not as great of an outcome from COVID or coronavirus than, say, individuals without diabetes, right? And this is largely because elevated glucose, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, drives inflammation and it drives immune dysregulation. So doing things to stabilize your blood sugar via, whether you're doing a ketogenic diet, whether it's via exercise. I mean, that's kind of another topic that we may talk about, is just purely on how do you regulate blood sugar, because we could spend a whole 2 hours just on that topic, but managing your blood sugar is key. Chronic stress and overtraining. Everyone knows that stress is a big killer, and this is a stressful time. So I think the better we can manage that, the better outcome we will have if we do get sick. Overtraining, I think, is a topic that not a lot of people talk about, because everyone talks about exercise being good. And for some individuals, overtraining isn't an issue to talk about. We just got to get them moving. Some individuals, myself included, tend to fall on the side of overtraining, right? Doing too much exercise or chronic cardio or, destroying your body in the gym day in, day out. Some individuals think that that may be beneficial, but that actually is going to lead to more inflammation and more immune dysregulation. Okay. Environmental pollutants, air quality, mold exposure, things like that, gut dysbiosis or issues in your gut. Now is not a better time to get your gut in shape, right? And I mean internally, chronic sinus issues, and then things like anemias or things that can create hypoxia or low oxygen. So, what some of these might look like on lab markers are what are called CRP or C reactive protein, ferritin, which is a marker for iron stores, hemoglobin A1C, which tells you in essence, the amount of blood sugar that's on a red blood cell, TGF beta, which helps you to look at inflammation and fibrosis from an infection, and then a stool test to look at dysbiosis, things like that. So some of you may know these markers and may have room to improve. Some, they may be perfectly optimized, right? But these are some things that I don't think there's a better time to start working on. I think if all these things can get in check, then I think you give yourself the better odds that if, God forbid, you do get sick with whatever, whether it's just a cold or some other infection, I would argue that you are increasing your odds that you're going to handle it better than someone who is maybe diabetic, killing themselves in the gym, their guts messed up, and they have an anemia, right? That individual may not do so hot with things like COVID or coronavirus or any sort of other infection, right? So these are things that I would suggest that everyone get rocking and rolling on, okay? So this is a cool picture we're going to talk through, and it's looks super complex, but I'll kind of break down, right? This is looking at the process of inflammation, and we're going to talk about how those different things influence inflammation and how certain supplements affect this entire pathway, okay? This is important or relevant, especially relevant in regards to coronavirus or COVID-19, right? This is looking at the process to create what's called an inflammasome, okay? An inflammasome is pretty much an inflammatory reaction in order to fight an infection, right? When we're looking at the current infection, remember, the problem is happening when there's excessive inflammation or excessive inflammasome production, right? That's one of the negatives with COVID is that individuals are creating excessive inflammasome responses that then's leading to tissue damage. So I would kind of argue, and my thought process is, well, let's look into the things we can do to modulate inflammasome production or inflammation, okay? So I want everyone to pay attention to a few different markers. The first one's going to be the SIRT2 or the SIRT2 in the green circle. And below it is what's called acetylated alpha tubulin, okay? When you have just alpha tubulin, you move into a direction where you don't create inflammation. When that alpha tubulin becomes acetylated, and don't worry what that necessarily means, right? But note that they're two different things, that creates that inflammatory response. So we have to look at what things cause that binding of that acetyl group and what things cause that to be removed, right? Things that cause it to be removed are things that are going to dampen inflammation. Things that cause that alpha tubulin to be acetylated are going to drive inflammation, okay? One of the large genes that plays a role in this is what's called your sirtuin genes. Some of you may have no clue what I'm talking about. Some of you who are interested kind of in the anti-aging world may know exactly what I'm talking about, right? The sirtuin genes are kind of like the darling genes or the main genes that are being studied in anti-aging, okay? You have, I think, about 7 SIRT genes. We're going to talk about sirtuin 2, okay? Things that activate your sirtuin 2 gene are going to be largely things like resveratrol, quercetin, calorie restriction. In this article, it's talking about how calorie restriction or fasting or things like ketogenic diets will activate sirtuin genes. So this is one of the ideas that fasting is beneficial or calorie restriction is beneficial is that it activates sirtuin genes, which then will decrease inflammation indirectly. So, now may not be a bad time if you're already doing it, right, to continue with something like intermittent fasting or, intermittent calorie restriction, things like that, because that will activate that sirtuin gene and decrease inflammasome production. Like I said, some other things that activate that are things like resveratrol, quercetin, things like berberine, things like rock lotus, or things like that, things that have to do with regulating. And those are all supplements that a lot of people take for diabetes, right? And this is why you can see is they activate that sirtuin gene. Okay. What are some things that inhibit that gene and cause inflammasome production? So ROS, or what are called reactive oxygen species, just think of that as inflammation. Alterations in potassium. We'll talk about this a little bit later when we talk about homeostasis, but alterations in electrolyte balances will lead to inactivation of that SIRT2 gene and lead to inflammation, right? And then alterations in pH and things like that. But you can see higher alterations in glucose, fatty acids, cholesterol, right? All those metabolic signs, if not in check, are going to lead to further inflammation. So we can see what things will create that inflammasome, right? And this makes sense why diabetics or individuals who are more metabolically unhealthy aren't responding well to COVID, is they're probably already producing excessive amounts of inflammasomes. And so I would say now is the time to start modulating that system with maybe calorie restriction, some intermittent fasting, things like resveratrol, quercetin, berberine, and different things like that to try to activate that SIRT2 gene to decrease inflammation. So really cool picture, complex picture, but we'll get into some more of those details a little bit later. Right? So I'd say big step one, easy thing everyone can get started on is subtract the inflammation. Easy to do and comes with pretty much no risks, right? All these things of cleaning up your diet and things like that, except for if there's individuals, with eating disorders, things like that, that's where, you need to be a little bit more careful. But if you don't fall into kind of that category, these are easy things to do, right? And a lot of times they don't cost a ton of money. You don't have to go out and buy a bunch of supplements. And I would argue if you're still eating crummy and you're not sleeping well and you're overtraining, your blood sugar's a mess, and you want to go buy a bunch of supplements, I would probably say you're wasting your time, right? Start with these things and then add the supplements on top to optimize things even better, right? The lower overall inflammation is, right, the better or the more adequate inflammatory response we can create when we have an infection or a pathogen. So I like this picture. We look at the onset phase of, say, an infection. So we have the pro-inflammatory mediators, and then we kill the infection, and then we have the pro-resolving mediators, right? So then our immune system says, okay, time to calm down inflammation and go through the resolution phase, and then we're good to go. That green curve is an ideal curve. Individuals with COVID that aren't doing so hot, right, fall into this red curve. You can see where they have the onset phase and they never have the resolution phase, and it just leads to more and more chronic inflammation and tissue destruction, right? So going into an infection, we want to have the lowest amount of inflammation already, right? That's going to give us one of the best chances that when we get sick from whatever it may be, that we have an appropriate response. If we go and inflame because our blood sugar is a mess, we don't sleep well, we overtrain, we have stress, we're not going to do so hot, right? And supplements can only do so much when all those other things aren't in check. So I would argue that those are key before we get into supplements. Right? This is going to be the one barrier system we're going to talk about, and then we're going to get into supplements and some protocols, is your gut barrier system, right? Your gut barrier system is really important because it's extremely long, right? It's an extremely long tube that's protecting you from the outside world, from things that you ingest, right? And move through your GI system. So your immune system in your gut is always scanning to say, do I like this? Do I not like this? When there's a lot of immune dysfunction or inflammation in the gut, this can lead to all sorts of immune compromise and increase in inflammatory molecules, right? So one of the big things we want to think about with fixing the gut is we want to strengthen what's called the gut epithelial or tight junctions. Like we talked about, barrier systems. Let's start by fixing the barrier system, and then we'll get into fixing the immune system. Two of my favorite things to fix the tight junction are things like glutamine or L-glutamine and things like colostrum. And I'll have a link that will show you some products that I really like that I use on a personal basis myself, right, that have both of those things, right? So L-glutamine has been something that's really researched with improving tight junctions. And actually, when we have large amounts of inflammation in the gut, it actually decreases glutamine. So low glutamine in the gut actually really has nothing to do with dietary intake. It has everything to do with inflammation. So the more inflamed your gut is, the lower glutamine levels you'll have, the more leaky your gut will be, and the more immune reactive you'll be, right? So that's where we like adding in the L-glutamine to tighten those junctions up, okay? After that, we want to improve immune tolerance, right? So we want to try to regulate the immune system in the gut so it doesn't become hyper responsive. Once again, you can use colostrum for this. The other thing is short chain fatty acids. Some people are taking these supplement wise. I'm not really sure on the effectiveness of those. I've only seen them be effective in the research when actually done rectally. And I don't know a lot of people that want to shove pills up their backside, but that isn't an option. Another way of getting them are actually by eating prebiotics, right? So fermented foods and the creation of prebiotics is actually what creates short chain fatty acids, and this helps to create immune tolerance. Once again, why are we talking about this is we want to do as much to decrease the hyperreactivity of the immune response going into some sort of infection. Okay. And then we want to modulate or balance the immune response. Like I talked about, if you have gut issues, there most likely is an imbalance between that Th1 and that Th2 response, or that's what the research tends to tell us, right? So we want to do things to balance that. A lot of times stimulate that Th1 response to decrease the Th2 response. Things that can do that are quercetin and then N-acetylcysteine. And we'll talk about those a little bit later, right? So then we want to modulate or balance the immune response. And then we want to calm down inflammation. And that's where things like curcumin, glutathione, and resveratrol can come into play, right? So you can see all these supplements play a role in doing different things. So colostrum will help you in certain aspects. N-acetylcysteine will help you in other aspects. And glutamine will help you in other aspects. But if you're trying to decrease inflammation versus tighten up those junctions, you may want to use different supplements or different tactics, okay? So let's look a little bit deeper into some of the research. This is some research looking at hyperglycemia and inflammation. So once again, how does blood sugar play a role in creating immune dysregulation, right? So elevated blood sugar can increase intestinal permeability, right? By increasing intestinal permeability, this leads to an increased risk of microbial infections or inflammation, right? So increased blood sugar pretty much breaks down your gut barrier system and most of your barrier systems, which leads to higher pathogen burden, right? That higher pathogen burden in the hollow organs leads to a polarization towards the Th2 side, which leads to a decreased activation of your innate immune response, which means indirectly this is going to lead to a lesser ability to fight infections, right? Or increased pathogen burden. So this is how you can see how high blood sugar or not having your blood sugar managed can indirectly affect your immune system via your gut, right? So that's why that's really, really important. This is a really interesting topic, and this goes back to, I think, kind of summarizing and making sense why all these things are important, right? This is looking at homeostasis or balance in inflammation. So going back to like we talked about, this NLRP3 inflammasome is one of the big inflammasomes they're discussing in regards to COVID-19 or coronavirus, right? And this inflammasome can drive tissue destruction in autoimmune processes, right? And it's being studied for its tissue destruction, once again, in COVID. Okay. So when we look at this, there's three things I want us to talk about: DAMPs, PAMPs, and HAMPs. Okay. So you might be asking from earlier kind of discussions in the lecture, well, how does the immune system even recognize self tissue versus pathogen, things like that, right? Well, you have what are called DAMPs, or damage-associated molecular patterns. So these are debris of damaged tissue. So maybe it's breakdown of your muscle from weightlifting or running, right? You have PAMPs, or pathogen-associated molecular patterns, right? This is the pattern of an infection. And then this is really interesting. It's called HAMPs, or homeostatic altering molecular process, right? So for a while, we just thought of damaged tissue or pathogens setting off an immune response. Alterations in homeostasis or balance in a cell can also kick off inflammation and immune dysregulation. So, once again, imbalances in blood sugar, imbalances in potassium, sodium, imbalances in iron, imbalances in pH, and things like that. Anything pretty much that creates imbalance in your body has the potential of driving that inflammasome and leading to autoimmunity and tissue destruction, right? This is super important because this pretty much brings validity to the more you can optimize diet, sleep, um, exercise, stress, and start adding in supplementation that's custom to your imbalances. And patients that have worked with us know that we take all of these things and we look at everything metabolically in their body that we possibly can. And we say, how can we optimize them, right? And by optimizing those, we're hoping that we can decrease the amount of homeostatic imbalance that occurs, which will drive that inflammasome production and will lead to worsening of autoimmune disease processes or possibly worse reactions when it comes to infections, right? So like I said, anything that alters cytoplasmic homeostasis, so that's pretty much just cell imbalance, can cause activation of this system, right? This is an important system, but we need to keep it in check, right? It's important to have this inflammasome happen if you're exposed to COVID, but you don't need a ton of this inflammasome production just sitting at home on quarantine, right? And we're all guilty of it, but everyone's sitting at home, maybe having some drinks, eating a bunch of foods, which I think is good, but it's also still an important time to take care of yourself and not be eating foods that aren't good for you, over drinking, smoking, right? Because you're just increasing inflammasome production so that if, God forbid, once again, you get infected, you may be setting yourself for maybe more intense of a reaction because of that low grade inflammation. So once again, these are things we want to focus on in getting in balance. And now is the time to do that. Few more things, and then we'll get into supplements and some protocols. This is a really cool paper talking about autophagy's role in immune function. Some of you may be saying, what the heck is autophagy? Some of you may know what that is. Autophagy is your ability to eat up or chew inefficient or dead cells, in this case, immune cells. So this is one of the big benefits of fasting, is that you activate autophagy, so you recycle dead inefficient immune cells and you create appropriate, less non-reactive immune cells, right? And there's some interesting research on fasting and autoimmune disorders in decreasing autoimmune responses. But what's really interesting is that this paper argues that you need appropriate autophagy mechanisms to produce natural killer cells via interferon gamma, right? So you need autophagy to create immune cells for you to fight infections. So autophagy cannot work so well, once again, in patients that aren't metabolically flexible, whether they are diabetics, thyroid issues, overweight, obese, don't sleep well, things like that, is going to decrease your body's ability to actually produce the immune cells that you actually need. This is why, once again, eating clean and then practicing things like intermittent fasting, prolonged fasting, calorie restriction, things like that, or even fasting mimicking diets, or certain supplements that stimulate autophagy. Those supplements are things like quercetin, resveratrol, what's called NAD, or NAD precursors like NMN or NR, which once again, some of you who are patients may actually be taking those things. Those are supplements that can stimulate that autophagy mechanism. So really cool to look at how that mechanism indirectly affects natural killer cell function by using that interferon gamma signaling that we talked about earlier. So once again, another reason why things like fasting or fasting mimicking diets or things like that can actually improve immune function. Anemias and hypoxia in immune function. Okay. When we look at, once again, natural killer cells help to fight viral infections. Hypoxia causes inhibition of natural killer cells, right? This is not good for infections. If you are anemic, your immune response is not going to be good as someone who isn't anemic, right? But some of the research shows that when you improve oxygen gradients, you start to create more natural killer cells, right? So it can be reversed. So pretty much anything that causes hypoxia will increase the risk of affecting natural killer cells, therefore decreasing your ability to fight pathogens or infections. This is another reason why things like hyperbaric oxygen therapy actually has some pretty cool research on being antiviral and antibacterial and actually being really good for your immune system and boosting your natural killer cells because you're just flooding your body with oxygen, right? And once again, I have a handful of patients who are anemic, and it's really important that they're managing that anemia with whatever was recommended, whether it's iron or certain dietary things, is because we want to keep that anemia away so that you can have appropriate natural killer cell function. Sleep and immune function. So this is really interesting. They've shown that with normal sleep patterns, this helps to support a healthy Th1 system. Sleep dysregulation, however, seems to alter that T cell polarization and shift you more into that Th2 dominant, right? So alterations in deep sleep and REM sleep can cause more of a polarization into that Th2 system, decreasing your ability to fight infections, right? Sleep disturbances can also increase certain inflammatory molecules like the NF kappa B, STAT3, and interleukin 6. Remember that STAT3 and that interleukin 6 are associated with those Th17 cells and also seem to be culprits in COVID-19, right? And we can see sleep imbalances increase those levels, right? So now is not a better time to get sleep in check, right? And in the future, we'll probably do another lecture on how do we go a little bit more in depth on how do we fix sleep? How do we hack sleep? Right. So my goal is to teach you these things and then start giving you the tools with specific lectures going more in depth with each of these topics. Okay. So pretty much altered sleep causes imbalances in your immune system, right? This leads to more susceptibility to infections. So let's get into some supplements. We got about 5 or 6 supplements. This is the good stuff that everyone's looking for. And then we'll talk about kind of a protocol or a thought of how to put them together. So we probably got about like 10 more minutes. We'll move through and then we'll wrap up for questions. So the first thing that I love in regards to immune function was called astragalus. And some of you may be taking this, some of you may be familiar. It's a Chinese herb, right? And it really works by increasing natural killer cell function, by increasing that interferon gamma. Remember, that's the chemical that the natural killer cell loves to use to kill infections, right? So it's immune stimulatory. It stimulates your immune or your innate immune system, right? So astragalus is really, really good in the acute phase of an immune response, right? So you're getting an infection, you want to bolster that Th1 response, you want to increase natural killer cell function. Astragalus can be really, really helpful in that. Next thing is andrographis, right? And this can come from mushroom extracts or things like beta glucans, but also it's another Chinese herb. And this was an interesting actual double-blind placebo-controlled trial looking at 180 individuals, 90 taking andrographis, 90 without, and looking at over a 5-day course, andrographis group had a significant reduction in the following symptoms: fever, headache, malaise or fatigue, muscle aches, and cough, right? So andrographis works similar to astragalus in that it increases natural killer cell function. It increases that innate immune system response, right? And it's been shown in research to be very effective in chronic sinus issues and respiratory infections, right? So another one I'm turning to personally during these times is saying, hey, we don't have direct research on it for the current infection, but it's worked for other strains, so could be a possibility of a good thing to have in your arsenal. Vitamin A, right? Vitamin A is a big one a lot of people talk about. Some research shows, and why it may be effective, is that remember that naive T cell can turn into all those different T cells. What retinoic acid or vitamin A does is it helps you convert into that Th1 cell and keeps you from turning into that Th17 cell that drives autoimmune processes and drives inflammation, right? So vitamin A helps to bolster that innate immune response but do it in a way where it keeps you from creating excessive inflammation. Once again, we want supplements that are going to boost our immune system, but also help to resolve the infection. We don't just want a bunch of things that are going to create more inflammation. We want things that help with the inflammatory response, but help resolve it, right? So we want supplements kind of with like a double win that kind of work on all aspects of the immune system. Vitamin A also can work as an antiviral via inhibiting that STAT3 we talked about and that NF kappa B, right? So vitamin A can also be an antiviral and keep viruses from hijacking your cell and replicating. So vitamin A is definitely in my arsenal of a really important supplement for this time. Next is vitamin D or vitamin D3, right? A lot of you know, right? That's a hormone, right? And this hormone actually plays a huge role in the production of interferon gamma, right? So it helps to create healthy natural killer cells, right? So we've kind of talked about this over and over again. The interferon gamma helps to stimulate those natural killer cells. Vitamin D also plays a large role in autophagy. Vitamin D helps you to be able to activate autophagy. So you can see where it works with a direct mechanism to natural killer cells and then an indirect mechanism versus via the autophagy to help create those natural killer cell productions. Okay. So vitamin D is really cool in helping bolster the innate immune response. It also plays a huge role in helping macrophages, right? So remember those garbage cans. And then with antigen presenting cells as well. So not only does it drive the innate immune system, it also links the innate to the adaptive immune system and helps to calm it down. So vitamin D is really cool and relatively pretty dang safe in that it's going to create a modulatory effect, right? And from my experience, I haven't found one person whose vitamin D is even close to sufficient. Most of the patients I test are way below lab limits. So most people would definitely benefit from vitamin D, right? And here's some ideas of how it seems to work. Next is vitamin C. A lot of you are probably familiar with vitamin C, right? In those emergency packs, but what does vitamin C do and how does it really work, right? So vitamin C is an essential nutrient that we cannot create, so we must get it from diet, right? When we look at some research, they indicate that low vitamin C is relatively quite common in Western populations. And deficiencies is the fourth leading nutrient deficiency in the United States. A little scary considering that we're a pretty developed country with access to quite a bit of food, but yet we're still deficient in such an important vitamin that plays such an important role in immune responses, right? So vitamin C is a very important antioxidant for inflammation. But here are the big ways it helps in the immune system. Helps to strengthen the barrier system via the skin and collagen. Helps with what's called neutrophil chemotaxis, which is pretty much the ability for neutrophils to move into infected tissues or sites. Acts as an antioxidant. Modulates leukocytes or B cells and T cells. And then improves engulfing or the function of the macrophage. So we can see here, vitamin C supports epithelial barrier function against pathogens. So it promotes oxidant scavenging activity in the skin, thereby protecting the barrier system. So check one, this helps with the barrier system. We like that. Step two, it helps with the phagocytes or the macrophages, and it enhances their ability to kill the pathogen, right? So when they engulf and they're going to kill that, it produces more of a robust response. So check two, helps with the innate immune response. The other thing it does is it also is needed for apoptosis or clearing of neutrophils. We didn't talk about this a ton, but one big thing is when macrophages or neutrophils engulf dead tissue or infections, they must die in a timely manner. If they don't, this leads to necrosis of the tissue, which leads to further damage and risk of autoimmunity. So we need neutrophils and macrophages to die appropriately. Vitamin C allows that to happen, right? If they don't die appropriately, this leads to further tissue damage, which we don't like. Once again, going back to things like COVID-19, we want appropriate apoptosis and clearance of dead tissue so we're not sitting there presenting dead lung tissue to our T cells and our B cells, which drive even more inflammation. Right? So another thing from the paper, vitamin C appears to be able to prevent and treat respiratory and systemic infections. And then this is looking at prophylactic prevention of infections via vitamin C. And you can see here using a pretty low dose. I kind of recommend in a lot of my patients in acute infections, anywhere between 2 to 5 grams, or some people will talk about 2 bowel tolerance. So until it gives you digestive distress, then you back off. That's kind of your dose. Vitamin C is really interesting when it comes to COVID because actually there's a lot of research showing that um, intravenous vitamin C is actually being very therapeutic with COVID patients. And that makes sense when we look at the mechanisms we've talked about. They haven't looked at oral administration, but I would imagine it would only help in that if you're low on vitamin C, most likely your response is not going to be adequate versus someone whose vitamin C is adequate. Once again, vitamin C is dirt cheap. It's super cheap and easy to get a hold of, and really no excuse why everyone shouldn't be supplementing with it at this time. We're going to wrap up. I think we got one or two more. Glutathione. For those of you, once again, who have been in our office, you know we love glutathione, right? And glutathione is really cool for a ton of different reasons, especially for lung health. The amount of research I was able to find showing that glutathione plays a huge role in modulating lung inflammation was crazy. Once again, I think that's super important, given that this current pandemic affects lungs largely, right? So macrophages, the garbage man, uses glutathione to modulate inflammation during the pro-inflammatory stages. So when we have inadequate glutathione levels, the macrophages produce too much inflammation and too many inflammasomes, and that creates more of an inflammatory response. So once again, we want inflammation, but not too much. Glutathione modulates that. During acute inflammation, epithelial lung fluid, glutathione levels assist in modulating inflammation. What a lot of the research shows is that, and we'll have a quote here in a second, is that the amount of glutathione present in the epithelial lung fluid pretty much correlates to how well someone's going to do from a respiratory issue, right? Because glutathione is your antioxidant that helps with the inflammation. So once again, low epithelial lung fluid glutathione is associated with more inflammatory lung diseases, right? So it modulates inflammation in the body and the lungs. Super important right now. I am taking this, and as I'll kind of talk to you, I'm actually nebulizing this to actually get it into my lungs. And we'll kind of talk about that a little bit more in a second. So going back, this is another paper looking at endocrine disruptors, but pretty much just environmental chemicals that cause a shift from your Th1 to your Th2 system. Once again, they do this by depleting glutathione. So this goes back to poor diet, exposure to poor air quality, mold, whatever it may be, is going to deplete your glutathione. Living in modern day society is going to deplete your glutathione levels. I don't care who you are, mine, everyone on this call is going to have lower intracellular glutathione because we just live in a toxic world. The problem with that is that low glutathione shifts us towards a Th2 polarization. Asthma, mucus, chronic sinus issues, chronic gut issues, inability to fight infections. Glutathione, when increased, is actually able to shift that balance back to that Th2 system, right? And then decreased glutathione levels can also affect those antigen presenting cells. So your ability to hand off pathogens or body tissue in an appropriate manner relies on glutathione. So when glutathione levels are down, vitamin D levels are down, you start to increase your risk that an autoimmune disease is going to occur from an infection or from damaged self tissue. So really, really important to get those levels up. This is a cool study, and this is where I'm going to talk about some of the things I'm doing. This is discussing, once again, glutathione levels in the lungs. So there's not a lot of research that shows that oral or even IV increase the amount in the lungs. It's still important to have in the body. The only thing that I found in the research that actually increases the amount of glutathione in the lungs is when it is nebulized, right? This was a review article looking at nebulizing glutathione for different types of inflammatory lung conditions. And you can see here, inhalation of glutathione is the only known method to increase glutathione levels in the lungs. The potential application of inhaled glutathione are numerous when one considers just how many pulmonary diseases and respiratory-related conditions are affected by deficient antioxidant status or overproduction of oxidants, poor oxygenation, or impaired host defense. So once again, oxidants, inflammation, poor oxidation, anemias, hypoxia, impaired host defense, everything we've talked about so far. So I'm not saying take your trisomal and pop it in a nebulizer. If anyone wants to kind of talk about what I'm doing, like I talk about at the end, I'd be happy to sit down with anyone and kind of discuss the things I'm doing. There can be some contraindications to this. People with asthma or certain lung conditions. Once again, there's no research on it for COVID-19, but there's a lot of research on it for other infections. And my thought is it's probably not a bad thing to increase glutathione levels in the lung in the short term. Okay. So this is something I'm doing. Like I said, talk to me if this is something you're interested in, because there's a right way to go about it and a wrong way to go about it as well. Okay. So immune boosting protocol. What should we think about doing? So let's kind of wrap this all up. Think about it in regards to an infection. So in the initial immune response, we want to do things to support our Th1 response and our natural killer cell function. So once again, now's a time where people might be popping a ton of curcumin, resveratrol. Not a bad thing, maybe not the best thing depending on where you are in an infection. In the initial stages, you really want to do things that are going to boost innate immune response, but not really reduce a ton of inflammation early on. Or we want herbs or things that will do both of those for us. So once again, Th1 stimulants, andrographis, astragalus, glutathione, vitamin A, natural killer cell stimulants, pretty much the same things, astragalus, andrographin, reishi, vitamin C. So you can start to see, how do these different supplements fit into your protocol and how they should be working. Because a lot of people are like, well, I'm taking this vitamin, but I don't really know if it's working. Well, now you have a good idea of when to implement it and how to implement it and what you should be expecting to see, right? And then we want to reduce inflammation. This is where things like curcumin, resveratrol, vitamin D, vitamin A, vitamin E, and glutathione play a role in regulating inflammation. I don't tell a lot of people to chug a ton of anti-inflammatories at the beginning of an infection. Now, once again, every patient's specific, and depending on your physiology and your biology and what's going on, sometimes that's important. Patients, when you're trying to fight chronic infections, you want to reduce inflammation at the same time. People with acute infections, I tend to leave it alone for the first few days. And then about 2-3 days in, I start layering those in to start resolving the situation. So you want to let inflammation go, and then you want to start quenching yourself with antioxidants and anti-inflammatories to bring that system down, right? Other things you can do is decrease underlying inflammation, stress, poor diet, poor sleep, overtraining, and environmental chemicals. So to summarize, my top supplements currently right now are glutathione and N-acetylcysteine. N-acetylcysteine is an amino acid that increases glutathione. Vitamin D, vitamin A, andrographis, astragalus, and vitamin C. Another big thing that I didn't mention in here that I think is really important is also zinc. And I should have put this in there because there's a lot of interesting things with zinc, and zinc being an antiviral. Once again, there's a lot of things. And I'm going to give you a link in a second to an area where I've custom made kind of my a whole bank that's got some of my favorite immune supplements. So you can go through and you can look and say, oh, I got that, or hey, I'd love to get that. And you can kind of see what I'm using. And then you can kind of get it online as well. And I think right now they're kind of running a thing where any purchase over, I think, $50 is free shipping. So I'm going to put a link in here in a second, and you can kind of see some of my favorite immune supplements, because once again, there's so many different ones out there. There's good quality ones and there's crummy quality ones. Like I said, vitamin C is a pretty safe one that you can kind of get anywhere. Things like glutathione, andrographis, astragalus, things like that, I would argue you want to look for better quality, especially glutathione as well. But these are going to be my top supplements for immune support. And now you have an idea of how these fit into your arsenal in creating or bolstering an immune response. So I want to thank everyone for hanging in there with me. I know that was a super dense lecture, but I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I hope you like the info. I'm going to put a link for any kind of current patients who are interested in kind of setting something up to sit down and create their own custom kind of immune protocol, where we can kind of review your lab work, your hormones, and your different things. We can set that up and kind of create your own custom protocol, because once again, we can go over your lab work and say, hey, maybe glutathione's right for you, maybe vitamin A, and talk about dosage. for those of you who aren't patients, I'd love to offer you a kind of a free 30-minute consult. It gives us an opportunity to kind of talk about what you have going on. If we think we can kind of help with whatever condition you have going on, or once again, talk about, do we want to look at some lab work so we can create a specific immune protocol for you, right? And then the other thing I'm going to do, and both these are going to be in the attendee chat, is going to be a link to, oh, if this will pull up. So these are going to be the two links. One is going to be towards a calendar. Oh, whoops. And then one is going to be to a website where you can look at my own kind of immune protocol and some of these supplements that I like using. And then honestly, you can get them there and they can get them shipped to you. So you don't have to go out and not be social distancing and things like that. So let me post those in there. So like I said, that top link is to set up a time to chat, whether you're an existing patient and we can talk about creating a custom immune protocol for you, or whether you're a new patient and you just want to kind of learn a little bit more about us and the things we do, or what kind of things we can do to help. I'd love to do that. And those are free 30-minute consults. So really doesn't cost you anything. I'd love to help. And we're currently doing those over the phone due to the current coronavirus situation. And then the last link, the full script, is to a website where you just have to create an account. It doesn't cost anything to create an account. You go in and then you can find where I've listed about 20 different supplements that have a lot of these things in there. And a lot of them are things that I'm taking currently. So go on there, grab some stuff, bolster your immune system. Thank you so much for coming out. I'm going to go through some questions now, and then we'll answer those. So feel free to start kind of throwing your questions out if you haven't. So let me go through. So Jim, yes, we will definitely, I'm recording this and I'm going to try to post this on Facebook, or maybe we'll send it out email for patients and things like that. And I can also send the link of the slide. So we'll definitely be doing that. So if you miss them, you can definitely do that. Let's see, some individuals may be very deficient in these. Is it prudent to take some of these in increased doses, especially herbs? Definitely. And this is what comes down to kind of custom testing. You're seeing what your vitamin D levels are. What are your vitamin A levels? What are your vitamin C levels? Magnesium, all those things. And that can create more of an accurate dosing. When you look at a lot of guidelines, people talk about taking, 2,000 IUs of vitamin D, which could be perfect for someone who's really deficient. We might want to be doing 10,000, 15,000, but it's also important that we combine it with things like vitamin A and vitamin K2. We don't want to take high doses of vitamin D by themselves. We want to take them with other fat-soluble vitamins. So really, more accurate testing can give us a better idea and customized dosage for that person. Because once again, vitamin A, D, and K, they're all fat-soluble vitamins. So you do want to be careful about overdoing them if your levels are already adequate. So if your levels are already at, say, 60 for vitamin D, I may argue, hey, maybe just do 1,000 IUs for maintenance, but you probably don't need to do 15,000, 20,000 IUs, okay? Okay, I see Allison, question on interested in the nebulizing the glutathione. We can, if you want, Allison, kind of set something up, or next time we chat, we can kind of go over that and I can walk you through that. And I'll be posting some videos actually on my Instagram of the system I'm using and the type of glutathione I'm using. So I've been experimenting with a few different types. Is there a preferred vitamin C that I like? I like a few different types. Some people are a fan of liposomal, which I think can be helpful. I'm not crazy about liposomal in high doses, just because you're getting so many phospholipids with that, which can kind of disrupt digestion. Honestly, any vitamin C will do. I think I use the Sunray form. Like I said, I have some ones listed from Designs for Health, Orthomolecular, really reputable companies that have some good vitamin Cs. So really, that's a safe one where it's a pretty inexpensive thing, ascorbic acid. So really, pretty much anyone will work. Just if you find a reputable brand, that will probably do. Cool. Well, doesn't look like there are any other questions. So I think we're going to wrap it up. Like I said, we have the link down there. So if you want to set up an appointment, I urge you definitely, especially if you are not a patient of ours, It's free. It's a time to kind of learn about us. We help with a lot of other conditions. We work with traumatic brain injuries and concussions, along with autoimmune disorders and various types of neuroautoimmune disorders. So we actually work with a wide variety of things. Or if you just want to learn how to bolster your immune system even more and create a custom protocol for you, you can click on that link, or you can give us a call at 303 781 5617. That's listed on this last slide. And then I would love for you guys to follow me on social media. That's my Instagram and my Facebook, Dr. Perry Maynard, for both of them. I'm going to be plugging out a bunch of content, especially with the COVID situation on immune function. I just did some on dizziness and concussion. So we'll be posting that for all of you guys to see. Would love and appreciate for you guys to share that so we can get this information out. And once again, thank you so much for everyone coming tonight. I hope everyone enjoyed that and learned something. And I hope everyone stays safe. Keep the social distancing. Please don't go out if you don't have to. Keep washing the hands and kind of following the CDC guidelines. We'll get through this. And everyone stay healthy. And I will see you guys in our next webinar. Have a great night.